A Grand Canyon sunrise spills red and gold across ancient stone, the light crawling down layer after layer of geological history. Clifford Brenneman stands at Mather Point, alone, his weathered hands gripping the rail with determination that comes from a lifetime of holding on to things that matter. He's 76 now, his frame still tall but bent slightly by the years, his eyes the color of storm clouds over Nebraska wheat fields. Those eyes hold the same intensity they did 50 years ago, though now they're rimmed with the red of sleepless nights and the weight of memory. The wind carries whispers of a promise made in another lifetime, a promise that cost him everything and gave him more than he ever imagined. He reaches into his coat pocket with fingers that tremble, not from age but from emotion, and pulls out a faded photograph, its edges soft from decades of handling. A young woman stares back at him, her blonde hair catching sunlight, her eyes holding determination and vulnerability in equal measure, a smile that once defied an entire war. He came back to remember. He came back to say goodbye. He came back because some places hold pieces of your soul. Arizona, 1944. The war raged across two oceans, consuming lives and cities with an appetite that seemed endless. Europe burned under tanks and bombs. The Pacific Islands turned red as American forces pushed toward Japan. But in the Sonoran Desert, thousands of miles from the front lines, a different kind of battle was brewing. Camp Florence sprawled across the sand like a temporary city, rows of barracks and mess halls and guard towers surrounded by chain-link fence and barbed wire that glinted like broken glass in the relentless sun. Over 3,000 German prisoners of war, captured in North Africa and Sicily and Italy, now found themselves in a landscape as alien as the moon. The desert heat was oppressive, turning the air thick and heavy, making every breath feel like work. At night, temperatures plummeted, leaving prisoners huddled under thin blankets, dreaming of home. Among them was Lieselotte Schreiber, 23 years old, a Red Cross nurse captured near Anzio during the brutal Italian campaign. She wasn't a soldier, had never fired a weapon, had taken an oath to heal rather than harm. But the Americans didn't care about such distinctions. Enemy was enemy. She worked in the camp infirmary, a long wooden building with windows covered in wire mesh, the air inside thick with the smell of antiseptic and sweat and the subtle scent of fear that permeated everything. Her hands were still skilled at healing, still remembered how to set bones and stitch wounds and cool fevers. But her heart struggled with bitterness that threatened to consume her. Every bandage she wrapped, every fever she cooled, every broken man she helped put back together reminded her of the family she left behind in Hamburg. Were they alive? Were they starving in the ruins of a city turned to rubble by Allied bombs? Did they think she was dead? The questions haunted her like ghosts, following her through her days and invading her dreams at night. She'd grown up in Hamburg's Altstadt, the old city, in an apartment overlooking the Elbe River. Her father had been a clerk in the harbor office, a quiet man who loved classical music and Sunday walks. Her mother baked bread that filled their home with warmth, and her younger brother Klaus had dreams of becoming an engineer. The war had shattered all of that. Klaus was conscripted into the Wehrmacht at 17, sent east to fight the Soviets. Her father became a fervent Nazi, swept up in the promises of glory and national rebirth, wearing his party pin with pride. Lieselotte had never believed, had seen through the propaganda to the rot beneath, but speaking against the regime meant death or worse. So she'd kept silent, joined the Red Cross, and tried to save lives while the world tore itself apart. Now she was here, in this desert prison surrounded by men who'd fought for a cause she'd never believed in, guarded by soldiers from a country she'd been taught to hate. Clifford Brenneman wasn't supposed to be there. He'd enlisted in the summer of 1942, 19 years old and burning with patriotic fury after Pearl Harbor. He'd expected combat, expected to storm beaches and liberate cities and come home a hero with medals on his chest. Instead, the Army assigned him to guard duty at a POW camp in the middle of the Arizona desert. 25 years old now, raised on a farm outside of North Platte, Nebraska, he believed in simple things that his father had taught him while they worked the fields together. Right and wrong, good guys and bad guys, America and the enemy. The world was straightforward if you paid attention. Do your duty, treat people fairly, and trust that justice would prevail. The Germans behind the wire were supposed to be monsters, the kind of people who'd burned synagogues and invaded peaceful nations and turned Europe into a charnel house. He'd seen the newsreels, watched the propaganda films. absorbed the message that these were not people but something less, something other. But the first time he saw Lieselota, his certainty wavered like a candle flame in wind. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, the heat already building despite the early hour. She was carrying a medical kit across the compound, moving with purpose between the infirmary and the prisoners' barracks. Her blonde hair was tied back in a practical bun, strands escaping to frame a face marked by exhaustion and something deeper, a weariness that went beyond physical tiredness. She wore a simple gray dress, faded from washing, and practical shoes that kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. The medical kit looked heavy, pulling her shoulder down, but she didn't slow or ask for help. There was a pride in her bearing, a refusal to show weakness even in captivity. She looked up just for a moment, and their eyes met across 30 yards of desert sand and wire fence. And Clifford saw something he wasn't prepared for. She looked human. She looked afraid. She looked like someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who'd been swept up by forces beyond her control. The moment lasted only seconds before she looked away, her jaw tightening, her pace quickening. But it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in Clifford's mind. The camp operated under strict rules designed to maintain order and prevent fraternization. Prisoners worked labor details 6 days a week, farming cotton and vegetables in fields irrigated from the Gila River, their labor contributing to the American war effort in a bitter twist of fate. They picked cotton under the blazing sun, their hands bleeding, their backs aching, while guards watched from the shade with rifles always loaded and eyes always watching. In return, they received adequate food, medical care, and treatment that, while far from luxurious, was worlds better than what Allied prisoners received in German camps. The Geneva Convention was followed, more or less, though enforcement depended heavily on individual commanders. Fraternization between guards and prisoners was strictly forbidden. The regulations were clear, posted in every guard station, repeated in every briefing. Maintain professional distance, no personal conversations, no gifts or favors. The prisoners are the enemy, and treating them as anything else is a betrayal. But rules, Clifford learned during those long months of guard duty, were made by people who'd never stood watch for 12-hour shifts in 100-degree heat, never seen the way loneliness could hollow out a soul. He started small, testing boundaries without quite breaking them. A nod when Lieselota passed on her way to the infirmary. A quiet morning when she emerged at dawn to check on patients. A steadying hand when she stumbled on loose gravel, catching her elbow for just a moment before propriety demanded he let go. She ignored him at first, her jaw set, her pride a fortress built from necessity. To acknowledge kindness from a guard from an American felt like collaboration, like betrayal of everyone suffering back home. But winter came to the desert, and with it, a cold snap that turned the usually mild nights brutal. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and the prisoners' barracks, designed for heat management rather than warmth, became ice boxes. The infirmary was worse, its isolation and poor insulation making it the coldest building in the compound. Lieselota worked the night shifts, caring for men with pneumonia and frostbite. Her fingers went numb, making delicate work nearly impossible. She wore every piece of clothing she owned, layered like armor, but it wasn't enough. Clifford noticed. He'd been raised to notice when people were suffering, a farm boy's instinct honed by years of caring for animals and helping neighbors through hard times. He found a wool blanket, government issue, thick and warm, technically assigned to guard quarters but never missed if one went walking. He waited until his patrol took him past the infirmary during a shift change, when no other guards were watching, and left it folded outside the door. No note, no name, just a small kindness in a world that had forgotten what kindness meant. A gesture that said, "You are seen. You matter. You deserve warmth." Lieselot found it 20 minutes later when she stepped outside for a breath of freezing air. She stared at the blanket for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities. A mistake? A test? A trap? But the cold was too intense for paranoia, and she was too tired to refuse help. She picked it up, felt its weight and warmth, and carried it inside. That night, wrapped in unexpected kindness, she thought about the young guard with careful eyes, the one who nodded and said good morning like she was a person rather than a number. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she didn't care. But when she wrapped that blanket around her shoulders during the midnight shift, When the cold tried to steal the feeling from her fingers and she could work again, she thought of him, and that thought, more than the blanket itself, provided warmth. His name was Clifford. She'd learned from listening to guards talk. They called him Cliff, sometimes Brenneman when officers were around. He was from Nebraska, somewhere in the vast middle of this enormous country. He didn't laugh at the cruel jokes some guards made about the prisoners, didn't participate when others mocked German accents or made crude gestures. He didn't look at her like she was vermin or a curiosity or prey. He looked at her like she was still a person, still possessed of dignity despite the circumstances, and that terrified her. Because if she let herself believe that, if she let herself hope that not all Americans were enemies, that maybe humanity could exist even here, then the walls she'd built around her heart might crumble, and she needed those walls to survive. Without them, the grief and fear and loneliness would drown her. Colonel Wendell Hargrave ran Camp Florence like the machine he believed it needed to be. Efficient, orderly, by the book. He'd served in the Great War, had seen the trenches of France, had watched men die in mud and gas and the senseless, grinding horror of industrial warfare. He'd come home with lungs scarred by mustard gas and a conviction that discipline and order were the only things standing between civilization and chaos. He noticed everything that happened in his camp, from supply discrepancies to guard rotations to the subtle shifts in prisoner morale. And he noticed the way Private Clifford Brenneman's patrols seemed to linger near the infirmary, the way his attention drifted toward a certain blonde nurse. He called Clifford into his office one February morning, the desert sun streaming through dusty windows, casting bars of light across the worn wooden floor. His desk was immaculate, papers stacked in precise piles, a photograph of his late wife in a silver frame. "Brenneman," he said, his voice like gravel tumbling in a mixer, rough but not unkind. "Sit down." Clifford sat, his spine straight, his hands on his knees, every inch the proper soldier, despite the fear crawling up his throat. "Sir?" Hargrave studied him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "You're a good soldier. You show up on time, you follow orders, you don't cause trouble. Your service record is clean. I respect that." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Don't make me regret saying that." Clifford's heart hammered against his ribs. "Sir, I don't understand." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Hargrave leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking slightly. "These people are prisoners. They're Germans. Some of them might have killed your buddies in France or Italy. We don't know their stories, and frankly, it doesn't matter. They're the enemy, Brenneman. The war's not over yet, and until it is, they stay on one side of that fence and we stay on the other. That's how this works." He leaned forward. "I know what's happening. Half the camp knows. You're not as subtle as you think. And if it were up to me, if I had the manpower, I'd transfer you tomorrow. But we're short-staffed and you're good at your job." He paused. "So I'm going to say this once. Think about what you're doing. Think about the consequences. Not just for you, but for her. Because if this goes bad, she's the one who'll pay the price. She's the prisoner, not you. Remember that." Clifford swallowed hard. "I understand, sir." Hargrave shook his head slowly. "No, son, I don't think you do. But you will. Life has a way of teaching lessons whether we want to learn them or not. You're dismissed." Clifford stood, saluted, and left, his mind spinning. He knew Hargrave was right. He knew he was playing with fire. But when he thought about Lieselotte, about the way her eyes had softened when she found that blanket, he couldn't make himself care about the risks. Not enough to stop. Spring brought new prisoners. Men captured in the Allied push through Italy as American and British forces ground their way north toward Rome. They arrived in trucks, dusty and exhausted, their eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of men who'd seen combat and lost. Among them was Dietrich Vogel, a former schoolteacher from Munich, 30 years old, with wire-rimmed glasses that had somehow survived the war, and a philosopher's temperament. He'd taught literature and history before the war, had loved his job, had believed in education as a path to enlightenment. Then the Nazis had come to power, and teaching had become propaganda. He'd been drafted, captured near Cassino, relieved that his war was over. He and Lieselotte became friends quickly, drawn together by shared language and shared loss. Dietrich had lost his wife Anneliese in a bombing raid on Munich. Her body never recovered from the rubble. He carried her photograph in his pocket. creased and faded, and sometimes took it out to stare at her face, trying to remember the sound of her laugh. Lieselotte had lost letters from home. The mail service from Germany choked to nothing. She didn't know if her family was alive or dead, and the not knowing was its own kind of torture. They sat together in the compound during recreation hours, precious time when prisoners could move freely within the fenced area. Dietrich and Lieselotte talked about books they'd read, places they'd seen before the war ruined everything. Goethe said that none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. Dietrich mused one afternoon, the sun beating down. But I think the opposite is also true. None are more free than those who accept their chains and choose how to carry them. Lieselotte smiled despite herself. That's very philosophical, Dietrich. Does it help? He shrugged. Sometimes. When I remember that this is temporary, that eventually we'll leave this place one way or another. He nodded toward Clifford, who stood watch near the fence. You should talk to him. Lieselotte stiffened. I don't know what you mean. Dietrich smiled sadly. Yes, you do, and you're afraid, I understand that. But Lotte, we're already prisoners, what more can they take from us? She didn't answer, because the truth was they could take everything. Hope, dignity, the fragile belief that somewhere, somehow, love might still exist. They could take the small kindnesses that made captivity bearable. And if she let herself care about Clifford, if she let herself believe that something could exist between them, and then it was taken away, she didn't think she'd survive it. Better to keep the walls up, to stay numb, to endure. But Dietrich's words stayed with her, echoing in the quiet moments. Clifford's sister Dorcas wrote him letters every week, faithful as clockwork, her neat handwriting filling pages with news from home. She was 28, a teacher in Omaha, sharp-minded and big-hearted, the kind of person who saw through pretense and valued honesty above all else. She'd always been the one who understood him, who knew when he was lying even to himself. They'd grown up close, only 3 years apart, partners in the endless work of farm life. When Clifford enlisted, Dorcas had been the only one who'd understood it wasn't really about patriotism, but about escape, about seeing something beyond the endless flat horizon of Nebraska wheat fields. In April, Clifford finally wrote back honestly, the words coming slowly, painfully. Dear Dorcas, he wrote, sitting in his barracks after midnight. There's a woman here. Her name is Lieselotte. She's German, a prisoner, a nurse who was captured in Italy. I know it's wrong. I know what everyone would say, what Mom and Dad would think, what the army would do if they knew. But Dorcas, when I look at her, I don't see the enemy. I see someone who's scared and brave and trying to hold herself together with nothing but willpower. I don't know what to do. I needed to tell someone, and you're the only person I trust not to judge me. He mailed the letter and spent 3 weeks in agony, wondering if he'd made a mistake. But when her reply came, it was everything he'd hoped for. Dear Cliff, she wrote, I won't pretend I'm not worried. What you're describing is complicated and dangerous. But I also know you, and I know you don't give your heart easily. If this woman has earned it, she must be extraordinary. The world is full of people who'll tell you who to hate. Don't let them tell you who to love. Follow your heart, and know that whatever happens, I'll stand by you. You're my brother, and I love you no matter what. Clifford read that letter a dozen times, carried it in his pocket like a talisman. Knowing Dorcas was on his side didn't solve his problems, but it gave him courage. If Dorcas believed in him, maybe he could believe in himself. Summer turned the camp into an oven, temperatures soaring past 110 degrees, the air shimmering with heat waves that made the horizon dance. The prisoners wilted, moving slowly to conserve energy. The infirmary saw a steady stream of heat exhaustion cases. Lieselotte worked 16-hour days dispensing water and salt tablets. Clifford watched her run herself ragged and worried, seeing the exhaustion in every line of her body. He found excuses to bring extra water to the infirmary, claiming the medical staff needed additional rations. Lieselotte accepted without comment at first, professional and distant. But one evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she spoke. Why do you do this? Her English was accented but clear. Be kind. We're enemies. Your country and mine. My people have done terrible things. Her voice cracked. I've seen the newsreels they show us. The footage of the camps, the atrocities, the death camps. I didn't know, not while I was home, they kept it secret, but now I know what was done in Germany's name. How can you look at me and not see that? Clifford set the canteen down slowly. Because you're not responsible for what other people did. You're just trying to survive, same as me. My dad used to say that you judge a man by his own actions, not by what his neighbors do. I figure that applies to everyone, regardless of where they're from. You didn't build those camps, you didn't order those killings, you're a nurse, you save lives. That's what I see when I look at you. Lieselotta's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. You don't understand. My brother was in the Wehrmacht. My father believed in the Reich, wore his party pin, supported Hitler. What does that make me? I lived in that country, benefited from its conquests, even if I didn't believe. Silence is complicity, isn't it? I should have spoken out, but I was afraid. So I said nothing and tried to help where I could and told myself that was enough. But it wasn't enough. It will never be enough. Clifford stepped closer to the fence, close enough to see the pain etched in every line of her face. It makes you human. That's all. Just human. We all make choices we regret. All carry things we wish we'd done differently. But you can't carry the weight of an entire nation's sins. That'll destroy you, Lotta. And the world needs people like you, people who heal instead of hurt. Don't let guilt take that away. It was the first time he'd called her by the nickname Dietrich used, and the intimacy of it hung in the air between them. Lieselotta stared at him, her breath catching. Thank you, she whispered, for the water, for the kindness, for seeing me as more than a prisoner. Then she turned and walked back into the infirmary, leaving Clifford standing at the fence, knowing that something fundamental had shifted between them. That conversation changed everything. They began to talk, brief exchanges stolen between duties. Lieselotta told him about Hamburg, the harbor where she'd watched ships come and go as a child, dreaming of distant places. She described the Christmas markets, the smell of roasted almonds and mulled wine, the way the city lit up with candles. She told him about her mother's bread, her brother's terrible jokes, the bookshop where she'd spent her allowance on novels. She spoke of these things carefully, as if handling fragile treasures. Clifford told her about Nebraska, wheat fields stretching to the horizon in waves of gold, the way thunderstorms rolled across the plains like invading armies. He described winter blizzards that buried the farm in snow, and spring floods, and summer nights so clear you could see the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. He told her about helping his father birth calves, about the satisfaction of a good harvest, about his sister Dorcas, and her determination to educate every child. They discovered shared loves, Beethoven's symphonies, which both had grown up hearing, the smell of rain, precious in the desert, fresh bread, books that transported you, the way sunlight felt on your face after a long winter. They discovered shared fears, too, that the war would never end, that they'd never see home again, that this connection was doomed from the start. But still, impossibly, they fell in love. Not the wild, reckless love of movies, but something quieter, built on whispered words and stolen glances in the desperate hope that maybe the world could be different. The other prisoners noticed. Some approved, seeing in Lieselotta's happiness a reminder that life existed beyond the wire. These were mostly the younger ones who'd been conscripted against their will, who'd never believed in the Reich's promises. Take what happiness you can find, one told her. God knows there's little enough of it. But others resented it, viewing any kindness from Americans as collaboration, as betrayal. These were the true believers, the ones who still thought Germany could win. They muttered about Lieselotta, called her names in German that made her flinch. Dietrich defended her fiercely, his mild-mannered demeanor hiding a core of steel. She's not betraying anyone, he snapped at a particularly vocal critic, a former SS officer who still carried himself with arrogant authority. She's just refusing to let hate destroy what's left of her heart. If that offends you, that's your problem, not hers. The argument escalated, voices rising, other prisoners gathering. It ended with Dietrich sporting a black eye and split lip, the SS officer confined to barracks, and Lieselotta crying quietly in the infirmary. Clifford heard about the fight the next morning, saw the bruises on Dietrich's face, and understood with cold clarity just how dangerous this situation was. Love in wartime wasn't romantic, it was dangerous. It was a rebellion against everything the world demanded. Opal Thibodeau ran a diner in Flagstaff, 45 years old, widowed for 3 years, her life defined by loss. She'd lost her husband to a heart attack in 1941, and her son Danny to German machine gun fire on Omaha Beach. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and it had destroyed her. Danny had been 20, full of life and plans, dreams of opening a garage. Instead, he'd died on a beach in France, cut down before he even reached the cliffs. The grief had hardened Opal into someone who saw enemies everywhere, who needed someone to blame. When rumors reached Flagstaff that a guard at Camp Florence was involved with a German prisoner, Opal was livid. "It's a disgrace," she told anyone who'd listen, her voice sharp with anger. "Our boys are dying over there fighting those Nazi bastards, and he's making eyes at the enemy. My Danny is dead, buried in France, and this guard is courting a German? It's wrong. It's betrayal." She didn't know Clifford, had never met him. She didn't know Lieselotte, didn't care to know her story. She only knew her son was dead, and someone had to be blamed. In September 1945, the war in Europe ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler dead in his bunker. The Third Reich collapsed. The prisoners at Camp Florence listened to radio reports with mixed emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped. Dread for what they'd return to. The Germany they'd left no longer existing. Grief for everything lost. Everyone dead. Some prisoners celebrated quietly. Others wept. Still others sat in numb silence. Lieselotte received her first letter from home in over a year, delivered through Red Cross channels. Her hand shook as she opened it, afraid of what it might contain. Her mother was alive barely, surviving in Hamburg's ruins with nothing but determination. The city had been destroyed by firestorms, Allied bombing turning entire neighborhoods to ash. Their apartment was gone, burned to nothing. Her brother Klaus was missing, presumed dead somewhere on the Eastern Front. Her father had died in an air raid in 1943. Everything Lieselotte had known was gone or broken. She read the letter alone in the infirmary, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. When Clifford found her that evening, she was staring at the desert sky, tears streaming silently down her face. He wanted to hold her, wanted to promise everything would be okay. But the fence still stood between them, and promises felt like lies. So he just stood there and let her know she wasn't alone. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry, Lotta." She nodded, unable to speak, and they stood together in silence as night fell. Two people from opposite sides of a war discovering that grief was universal. Colonel Hargrave called Clifford in again in October. This time his tone was different. Not angry, but tired. "Brenneman, sit down. We need to talk." Hargrave looked older, the lines in his face deeper. "I'm going to be straight with you. I know what's going on between you and the German nurse. Hell, half the camp knows. The war's over in Europe. These prisoners will be repatriated, sent home. The process will take months, but it'll happen. Think about what that means. She can't stay here as a prisoner forever, and you can't follow her to Germany. So what's your plan?" Clifford met his eyes. "I'm working on it, sir. There are legal options, immigration procedures, ways for her to stay if she wants to." Hargrave sighed. "Then God help you both, because the world isn't kind to people who cross the lines it draws. You'll face prejudice, anger. Your family might disown you. Her family might hate you. You'll have to live with that for the rest of your lives. Are you ready for that?" Clifford thought about Dorcas's letter, about the promise to stand by him. "I think so, sir. I hope so." Hargrave nodded slowly. "Then I wish you luck, son. You're going to need it." Winter came again, the desert cooling. The prisoners prepared for repatriation, a process complicated by chaos in post-war Germany. The country was divided into occupation zones, infrastructure destroyed. Lieselotte didn't want to go back. There was nothing left but rubble and ghosts. But staying meant navigating a legal maze. It seemed impossible. Clifford researched desperately, spending off-duty hours in the camp library, writing letters to immigration offices, military liaisons, anyone who might have answers. Dorcas helped from Nebraska, contacting lawyers, gathering information. "You can do this," she wrote. "Love is worth fighting for." He found a possible path, a provision in immigration law that allowed former enemy nationals to apply for entry if they could demonstrate they weren't security risks and had American sponsors. It would require paperwork, interviews, background checks, approval from multiple agencies. It would take time and money and persistence, but it was possible. When he told Lieselotte, her eyes widened with hope. In February 1946, almost 2 years after they'd first seen each other, Clifford received approval for a furlough. He'd saved every penny for months, made arrangements, pulled strings. He'd also, in a moment of terrifying courage, asked Colonel Hargrave for help. The old soldier had stared at him, then sighed and made a phone call using his authority to cut through red tape. "I must be getting soft in my old age," Hargrave muttered. "Don't make me regret this, Brenneman." He told Lieselotte to trust him. She did, though trust felt like stepping off a cliff. They traveled north under military escort, Lieselotte technically still a prisoner, Clifford technically still her guard. The destination, Grand Canyon National Park. Clifford had never seen it, but he'd heard stories his whole life. A place so vast it made human conflicts seem small. A place where the earth itself testified to time's passage, to survival, to the stubborn persistence of beauty. They arrived at dawn, the sky just beginning to lighten. They walked to Mather Point, Clifford's hand steady on Lieselotte's elbow as they navigated the rocky path. When they reached the rim and she saw the canyon for the first time, Lieselotte gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The sun rose slowly, spilling light across layers of stone, each stratum a different color, red and orange and gold and purple, millions of years of history exposed and beautiful. The canyon stretched before them, vast beyond comprehension, the Colorado River a thin ribbon far below. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, a reminder that the world contained more than war and suffering. Clifford watched her face, saw pure joy there for the first time in all the months he'd known her. No fear, no sorrow, just wonder and happiness. He took her hand, felt her fingers intertwine with his, and knew this was the moment. "Lieselotte Schreiber," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't have much. I don't have a fancy ring or a big house or a future that makes any sense on paper. My family might not accept you, and your family might not accept me. The world is going to judge us, and people are going to say terrible things. But I have a heart that's yours, completely and forever if you'll take it. I promise to stand by you, to fight for you, to build a life with you wherever that life takes us. Will you marry me?" She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. For a moment she couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at this man who'd seen her at her worst and loved her anyway. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, Clifford. 1,000 times yes. I'll marry you, and I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful that even in the middle of a war, even when everything was terrible, I found you." They kissed there, on the edge of the world. Two people who'd been enemies becoming something new, becoming hope, becoming proof that love could survive anything. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in a small chapel in Flagstaff, a simple wooden building with worn pews and stained glass windows. It wasn't the wedding either of them had imagined as children, but it was theirs. Dorcas traveled from Omaha to stand as witness, her eyes filled with tears as she hugged her brother. "You're my sister now," she told Lieselotte firmly, "and anyone who has a problem with that can answer to me." Dietrich attended, released from the camp and awaiting deportation wearing borrowed civilian clothes. He shook Clifford's hand and kissed Lieselotte's cheek. "Be happy. You've earned it." Colonel Hargrave sent a telegram. "Best wishes to you both. You're braver than I am." Hargrave. But not everyone was happy. Opal Thibodeau stood outside the chapel, silent, her face a mask of disapproval. Lieselotte saw her as they left, saw the judgment in her eyes, and felt the old shame rise. But Clifford squeezed her hand. "Let them stare. We know who we are. We know what we have. That's all that matters." They moved to Nebraska, to the farm Clifford had inherited when his father died. The community was cold at first, whispers following them everywhere, people crossing the street to avoid them. Lieselotte felt the hostility like a physical weight, but she refused to give in. She worked hard, learning the rhythms of farm life, helping with planting and harvest, cooking meals, proving through actions that she was more than the enemy they saw. She took English lessons from Dorcas, determined to speak without an accent. She helped neighbors when they'd let her, bringing food when someone was sick. Slowly, grudgingly, acceptance came. It started with the women, mothers who saw Lieselotte working herself to exhaustion and recognized a kindred spirit. Then the older men, veterans of the Great War who remembered that Germans were people too. The younger generation was often the most forgiving, seeing in their love something romantic rather than treasonous. It took years, But eventually they became part of the community, their story becoming part of local lore. They had 2 children, a daughter named Dorcas after Clifford's sister, and a son they named Dietrich after the friend who'd encouraged their love. They raised them on the farm, teaching them to work hard and treat people fairly and understand that nationality was an accident of birth, not a measure of worth. They planted wheat and raised cattle and built a life that was ordinary and extraordinary all at once. They told their children stories about Hamburg and Nebraska, about the war and the camp and the Grand Canyon, making sure they understood where they came from and what it had cost. Years passed. The children grew, went to college, started families. Clifford's hair turned gray, then white, his body marked by decades of farm work. Lieselotta's hands became lined and calloused, the hands of someone who'd worked hard and lived fully. They returned to the Grand Canyon on their 10th anniversary, their 20th, their 30th. Each time they stood at Mather Point and remembered the day they'd chosen each other over the world's expectations. In 1994, Lieselotta was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It moved fast, merciless, the doctors giving her months at best. She faced it with quiet courage, refusing to waste her remaining time on anger or self-pity. On a cool October evening, with Clifford holding her hand and their children gathered close, she whispered, "Take me back there. When I'm gone, take me back to the canyon. Let me rest where we began. Let me be part of that beauty forever." Clifford promised through tears, "I will. I swear I will, Lotta." She died 3 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, Clifford beside her as he'd been for nearly 50 years. The funeral was well attended, the church packed with people whose lives she'd touched. Clifford kept his promise. He drove to the Grand Canyon with her ashes in an urn beside him, making the journey alone because this was something he needed to do himself. He scattered her ashes at Mather Point, watching them catch the wind and spiral down into the vast emptiness. "Rest easy, Lotta. You're home now. You're free." A year passed. The loneliness was crushing, the house too quiet without her presence. His children worried, visited often, but they had their own lives. Dorcas, now elderly herself, called every week. "You did good, Cliff. You gave her a beautiful life. You proved that love was stronger than hate." But Beautiful didn't fill the empty space beside him in bed. Beautiful didn't answer when he spoke to the silence. He went through the motions of living, but it felt hollow. In the spring of 1995, Clifford returned to the Grand Canyon one last time. He drove slowly, seeing the landscape with new eyes. He checked into a hotel near the park, spent the night staring at the ceiling, and rose before dawn to drive to Mather Point. He stood at the rail, the same spot where he'd proposed 50 years before, and felt the weight of all those years. The joy, the struggle, the love that had defied a war and won. He thought about Lieselotta, about the scared young woman in a prison camp who'd dared to hope. He thought about the guard who'd learned that enemies were just people on the other side of a fence. And he thought about Opal Thibodeau, who'd come to their 25th anniversary party, tears in her eyes, and apologized. "I was wrong," she'd said simply. "I let grief make me cruel, but you two showed me I was wrong. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." Clifford pulled out the photograph, the one of Lieselotta at the canyon in 1946, young and radiant and alive with hope. He kissed it gently, then tucked it back into his pocket close to his heart. "I kept my promise, Lotta," he whispered to the wind. "I brought you back home, and now I'm ready. I'm ready to rest too." The sun climbed higher, warming the ancient stone. Tourists began to arrive, cameras clicking, voices exclaiming at the view. Clifford watched them, these people who had no idea what this place meant, what it had witnessed, and that was okay. Some stories didn't need to be told to strangers. Some stories just needed to be lived, to exist as proof that love could survive anything. He turned from the rail, his steps slower than they'd once been, but still steady. He'd come back to remember. He'd come back to say goodbye, and now finally he could let her rest. Because love didn't end when the world did. Love was the thing that outlasted everything, even war, even death, even time itself. It was the one thing that mattered, the one thing worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of love, courage, and the human spirit that transcends borders and conflicts. Hit the like button if this touched your heart and let us know in the comments. Have you ever heard a story like Clifford and Lieseladas? Share your thoughts with us.